The two red dresses were a slash of defiance against the dust and sun-bleached wood of the church. They were made of silk, a fabric that had no place in the hard-scrabble territory of Nevada in 1878, and their color was the bold, unapologetic red of a wedding celebration that felt more like a funeral. Inside them, twin sisters May and Ann stood perfectly still, their hands clenched at their sides. At 18, they had the same smooth, dark hair, the same delicate curve of their jaw, the same eyes that were now fixed on the floorboards, seeing nothing but the end of the world they knew. Their father, a man broken by the railroad and the promises of the West, had sold them. He had not used that word, but they understood it. His debt to Mr. Alistair Sterling, the man who owned the general store, the freight company, and nearly every soul in the town of Redemption, had become a noose. This was the only way to loosen it. They were to be married, both of them, to the same man. The man stood before the nervous circuit preacher, his back to them. He was a stranger, a cowboy Sterling had produced like a rabbit from a hat. They had not been told his name. They only knew he had a small homestead claim some miles out of town and had paid their father's debt in full. A tremor of fear passed through May, and she felt Ann's hand find hers, a small, cold comfort. May was the elder by minutes, a responsibility she wore like a second skin. She was the shield, the one who faced the world so Ann could observe it. Now she felt utterly defenseless. The preacher cleared his throat, his voice cracking in the stifling heat. "We are gathered here today," he began, his eyes darting toward the pews where Mr. Sterling sat alone, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. The rest of the town had the decency to stay away, though May could feel their judgment pressing in through the thin clapboard walls. The cowboy turned. He was not what she had expected. He wasn't coarse or cruel looking. His face was weathered by the sun, carved with lines of hardship, but his eyes were a startlingly clear blue, and they held no malice. They held a deep, unnerving quiet. He was tall and lean, his hands calloused and capable, resting awkwardly at his sides. He looked at them, his gaze moving from May to Ann and back again, and for a fleeting moment something like sorrow flickered in their depths. "State your name," the preacher mumbled. "Caleb Reeves," the man said. His voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the preacher's unease. The ceremony was a blur of mumbled words and legal necessities, a grim transaction sanctified by a reluctant man of God. When the preacher asked if they, May and Ann, took this man to be their husband, it was Sterling who answered for them from his pew. "They do," he announced, his voice booming with ownership. The preacher flinched but did not argue. Caleb Reeves said nothing, his jaw tight. When it was over, they were pronounced man and wives. The words hung in the air, a legal and moral monstrosity. There was no kiss, no celebration. Caleb simply nodded once to the preacher, turned, and walked toward the door. He paused on the threshold, waiting for them. May took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and pulled Ann with her. As they stepped out of the church and into the blinding sunlight, they left their childhoods behind. They were no longer the daughters of Wei Chin, the quiet railroad worker. They were the wives of Caleb Reeves, a stranger who had bought them with a parcel of land and a handful of coin. Their future was a vast, terrifying unknown, stretching out like the dusty road that led away from everything they had ever known. The wagon ride to Caleb's homestead was conducted in a suffocating silence, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the horse's tack. Caleb drove the team with a quiet focus, his eyes on the horizon. May and Ann sat on the bench beside him, their red silk dresses a stark and foolish proclamation in a world of brown dust and gray sagebrush. They felt the stares of the few people they passed, the whispers that followed them like a trail of smoke. May studied the man beside her. He had not spoken a word since leaving the church. He seemed less a husband and more a warden, transporting them to their prison. Yet his presence was not menacing. There was a deliberation in his movements, a stillness that was more thoughtful than threatening. He handled the horses with a gentle hand, his low voice calming them over a rough patch of road. It was a small thing, but in their world of fear, small things mattered. After nearly an hour, he turned the wagon off the main track and onto a smaller, less traveled path that wound its way into the low hills. The land here was rockier, but dotted with stubborn pines that offered patches of shade. Finally, they crested a small rise and looked down into a shallow valley. There sat a cabin. It was small, built of sturdy timber with a stone chimney, but it was tidy. A corral stood nearby, its fence in good repair, and a small but well-tended vegetable garden was protected from critters by a low fence. A lone horse, a handsome bay, watched their approach from the corral with curious eyes. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. "We're here," he said, the first words he'd spoken directly to them. He got down and walked to the back of the wagon, not waiting for them. May exchanged a look with Anne. This was it. This was their new life. They climbed down, their silk slippers sinking into the soft dirt. The cabin had 2 rooms they saw upon entering. The main room served as a kitchen and living space, with a large hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. A single bed stood in the corner. The second, smaller room was barely more than a storage space, filled with sacks of flour, tools, and supplies. It was a man's home, Spartan and practical, but like the outside, it was clean. The floor was swept, the pots by the hearth were scrubbed, and there was no clutter. Caleb brought in their single small trunk, which contained all their worldly possessions, a few changes of clothes, their mother's combs, and a small bundle of letters from relatives they would likely never see again. He set it down near the bed. "This room is yours," he said, gesturing to the main room with the bed. "I'll sleep in the other." May stared at him, bewildered. "Both of us?" He nodded, not meeting her eyes. "The bed is big enough. I won't bother you." He turned and began to unhitch the horses, his shoulders set with a tension that spoke of some deep internal conflict. That night they lay side by side in the strange bed, the scratchy wool blanket pulled up to their chins. They could hear Caleb on the other side of the thin wall, settling onto what sounded like a pallet on the floor. He had cooked them a simple meal of beans and bacon, which they had eaten in silence at the table. He had been polite, almost formal, asking them nothing, demanding nothing. It was more confusing than outright cruelty would have been. "He is not a monster," Anne whispered in the darkness, her voice barely audible. "We don't know what he is," May whispered back, her voice tight. "Monsters can wear many faces. Remember Mr. Sterling's smile." A week passed in this strange, quiet rhythm. Caleb would rise before the sun, tend to his animals, and work his land. He was breaking new ground for a winter wheat crop, a back-breaking task of clearing rocks and turning the stubborn soil. May and Anne took over the duties of the cabin, cooking, cleaning, and tending the garden. He spoke little, but he was not unkind. He left a bucket of fresh water for them each morning and ensured the wood box was always full. He treated them like guests, not wives. The true test came when their supplies ran low. They had to go to town. The thought filled May with a cold dread. Caleb seemed to share her reluctance, but there was no choice. The town of Redemption was just as judgmental as they had feared. As they walked from the wagon towards the general store, owned by Mr. Sterling, Conversations stopped. Doors closed. Faces peered from behind curtains. They were a spectacle. The stoic cowboy and his two identical foreign brides. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a voice cut through the silence. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in." Alistair Sterling stood in the doorway of his store, blocking their path. He was a large man, his wealth apparent in his fine suit and the gold watch chain stretched across his considerable belly. His smile was wide and predatory. "Reeves," he said, his eyes not on Caleb but raking over May and Ann, "enjoying your new acquisitions? I trust you're finding them obedient?" Caleb stepped slightly in front of the sisters, a subtle but clear protective gesture. "We've come for supplies, Sterling, nothing more." "Oh, I'm sure," Sterling sneered, his gaze lingering on May's face. "But you see, their father's debt was considerable. A man might think a simple land deed wasn't quite enough to cover it. A man might think there are still services to be rendered." May felt a hot surge of fury and shame. He was speaking of them as if they were livestock, his property on loan. She saw several townsmen watching from across the street, their faces a mixture of fear and cruel amusement. This was a public humiliation. Before she could say anything, Caleb spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made Sterling pause. "The debt is paid. The contract is satisfied. They are my wives under the law of this territory." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You will not speak to them. You will not look at them. Their business with you and yours with them is finished." Sterling's smile faltered, replaced by a dark flush of anger. He was not used to being challenged, especially by a homesteader he considered little more than dirt. "You're a fool, Reeves. You think that little piece of paper from the land office makes you a king? This is my town. The people here know who holds the power." "I'm not trying to be a king," Caleb said, his blue eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I'm just a man telling you to stay away from his family. Now, are you going to let us pass? Or do we have to take our business to the next town over?" The threat was clear. Sterling's store relied on the custom of every settler in the area. Losing even one would be a sign of weakness. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Sterling's eyes narrowed into hateful slits. Finally, with a short, ugly laugh, he stepped aside. "Have your supplies, sodbuster," he spat. "But you'll find this land can be very unforgiving to those who don't know their place." Caleb nodded once, then motioned for May and Ann to enter the store. They hurried past Sterling, avoiding his venomous glare. Inside, they gathered what they needed, the tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. Caleb paid in coin, his movements precise and calm. But May saw the faint tremor in his hand as he counted out the silver dollars. He was not as unaffected as he appeared. The ride back to the homestead was as silent as the first one, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of shared battle, of a line drawn in the sand. When they arrived back at the cabin, Caleb went immediately to the corral to tend the horses. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. May and Ann put away the supplies. The confrontation had shaken them, but it had also shown them something new. Caleb Reeves was not just a quiet man. He was a brave one. He had stood up to the most powerful man in their world. For them. Later that evening, as Caleb sat outside mending a piece of tack, Ann watched him from the cabin doorway. He was humming to himself, a low, absent-minded tune. It was a simple melody, one she couldn't quite place, but it stirred something deep within her, a faint echo from a time she could barely remember. It sounded like a lullaby, one her father used to sing when they were very small, living in the noisy, chaotic railroad camps. She didn't understand how this stranger, this American cowboy, could know a tune from her own forgotten childhood. The question settled in her heart, a tiny seed of mystery that promised to grow into something much larger. That night, a summer storm broke over the valley. Rain lashed against the roof and wind rattled the single window pane. The noise made the small cabin feel even smaller, trapping the three of them in an enforced intimacy. The air was thick with unspoken questions. May could no longer bear it. She sat up in the bed she shared with her sister. Ann was awake, her eyes wide in the dim light from the dying embers in the hearth. Across the room, a flash of lightning illuminated Caleb, sitting on his pallet, his back against the wall, staring into the fire. "Why?" May's voice was sharp, cutting through the sound of the storm. Caleb looked up, his expression unreadable. "Why what?" "Why us?" she pressed, her voice gaining strength. "You could have had any woman. You could have sent for a bride from the East. Why did you pay our father's debt? Why did you agree to this?" She gestured around the room, at the strange arrangement that was their life. Caleb was silent for a long time, the only sounds the drumming rain and the crackle of the fire. He looked from May's defiant face to Ann's questioning one. He seemed to be wrestling with a decision. Finally, he sighed, a sound of deep weariness, and reached for his saddlebag which lay beside him. He pulled out a small, dark wooden box, its surface worn smooth with time and handling. He held it in his hands for a moment before placing it on the rough-hewn table between them. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two small silk ribbons. One was the color of a summer sky, the other a pale, buttery yellow. They were creased and frayed, clearly very old. "I was a boy," Caleb began, his voice low and rough with emotion. "No older than 10. An orphan, working for the water crew with the Central Pacific. It was a hard life." He looked at them, truly looked at them, and for the first time they saw a vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored their own. "Your father, Wei Chen, was a laborer on the grade. I remember him. He was a quiet man, but he had kind eyes." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I remember you two. You couldn't have been more than 3 years old. You were like two little dolls, always together, chattering away in a language I couldn't understand. In all that grit and sweat and misery of the camps, you were bright. You were the only beautiful thing for 100 miles. A memory, hazy and distant, flickered in Ann's mind. A dusty landscape, the clang of steel on steel, the smell of her father's sweat. "I used to watch you play by your tent," Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the ribbons, "just to see something good in the day. One afternoon, I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Your father saw me. He didn't have much himself, but he broke off a piece of his own rice cake and gave it to me. He said nothing. He just handed it to me." Caleb's voice grew thick. "While I was eating, you two ran up to me. You were shy, hiding behind your father's legs. Then one of you, I don't know which, you reached out and tucked these into my pocket." He looked up at him, his blue eyes shimmering in the firelight. "A piece of bread and 2 little ribbons. It was the greatest kindness I had ever been shown. I never forgot it. I kept the ribbons. They were my proof that there was still some good in the world." He told them how he'd left the railroad, worked as a ranch hand, saved every penny, and finally filed his own homestead claim. He had built this life with his own 2 hands. Then, a few months ago, he'd heard whispers in town. Wei Chen had fallen deep into debt with Sterling, and Sterling was planning to take his daughters as payment to work in the back rooms of his saloon. "I couldn't let that happen," Caleb said simply. "I went to Sterling. I offered to buy the debt. I used every dollar I had, even sold my spare horse. But Sterling, he's a cruel man. He wouldn't just take the money. He wanted to see your father humiliated. He said the only way he'd agree is if I took you both, as wives. It was his way of making a spectacle, of showing everyone his power. It was this, or let him have you. There was no other choice." The room was silent save for the rain. The truth of it settled over May and An, a heavy, transformative weight. This man was not a stranger. This marriage was not a purchase. It was a rescue. A 15-year-old debt of kindness being repaid. He hadn't bought them. He had saved them. May felt the hardness inside her crack. The anger she had been nursing for weeks dissolved, replaced by a profound, aching gratitude. Anne reached out and gently touched the faded blue ribbon, the texture familiar beneath her fingertips. The vague memory of the lullaby clicked into place. It wasn't her father's song. It was a tune one of the Irish workers used to whistle, a tune a young, lonely boy might have picked up and hummed to himself for years. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of the territorial marshal, a stern man with a silver star on his vest. Alistair Sterling was with him, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Caleb Reeves," the marshal said, his voice official and grim. "I have a complaint filed by Mr. Sterling here. He claims this homestead patent is fraudulent. He has a prior claim deed filed and registered with the territorial office." Sterling produced a roll of papers with a flourish. "My survey was completed last year, Marshal. This man is a squatter and a fraud. The land is mine." Caleb's face went pale. "That's impossible. My claim was filed under the 1862 Act. It's legal." "The paperwork says otherwise," the marshal said, looking at Caleb with suspicion. "I'm giving you 1 week to produce evidence to the contrary at the county seat. If you can't, you'll be evicted, and the land, and everything on it, reverts to the legal owner." Sterling's eyes swept over the cabin, the garden, and then settled on May and Anne with a look of vile possession. The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. If Caleb lost the land, they would lose their protector. They would be homeless, destitute, and Sterling would be there to collect his prize. That night, despair settled over the cabin like a shroud. Caleb sat at the table, his head in his hands. "He's beaten me," he whispered. "I can't fight him. He has money, connections. I'm just a homesteader. We should pack what we can and leave before the marshal comes back." "No," a quiet voice said. It was An. Both Caleb and May turned to look at her. She had always been the follower, the quiet observer, but now her eyes burned with a fire they had never seen before. "We do not run." "An, he will destroy us," May said, her own newfound hope wavering. "He will destroy us if we run," Anne corrected. "Our father, he bowed his head to men like Sterling his whole life, and it broke him. I will not bow." She looked at Caleb. "You have your copy of the homestead claim, the one you filed?" Caleb nodded, pulling a worn oilskin pouch from a chest. "Here, but what good is it?" "My father taught me to read English," Anne said, a fact she had never shared with anyone but her sister. "He used old newspapers from the camps. He said knowledge was the one thing they could not take from us. Let me see the papers, both sets, yours and the one the marshal showed you." Caleb described Sterling's document from memory as best he could. For the next 3 days, Anne, with May at her side, pored over Caleb's deed. They sat by the fire late into the night, tracing the legal language with their fingers, whispering the unfamiliar words to each other. Caleb watched them, a flicker of hope warring with years of ingrained defeat. He saw in them a resilience he had not realized he'd been missing in himself. They were not just victims to be saved. They were fighters. On the third night, Anne let out a small gasp. "Here," she said, her finger pointing to a string of numbers on the document. "The surveyor's mark. Section, township, range. And this is the date of the territorial survey upon which the map is based." She looked up, her eyes bright with discovery. "I remember the date on Mr. Sterling's deed. The survey he used was from 1877. "So?" Caleb asked, not understanding. "Your claim," Anne said, her voice trembling with excitement, "was filed and recorded in the spring of 1876. How can his deed be based on a survey that did not exist until a year after yours was already legal?" It was a blatant, arrogant fraud. Sterling had been so sure of his power, so certain no one would ever challenge him, that he hadn't even bothered to forge his documents carefully. The nearest telegraph office was in a town 30 miles away. Caleb rode all night, pushing his horse to its limit. He sent a message to the U.S. Land Office in Carson City, detailing the discrepancy Anne had found. For 2 days they waited, the threat of the marshal's return hanging over them. On the morning of the 6th day, 2 men rode into the valley. One was the territorial marshal. The other was a stern-faced official from the land office. Sterling was not with them. The official spent an hour reviewing Caleb's papers and the land markers. He confirmed what Anne had discovered. The claim was ironclad. Sterling's deed was a clumsy forgery. "Mr. Sterling has been invited to Carson City to explain several of his land dealings," the official said dryly. "I don't expect he'll be returning to Redemption any time soon." He tipped his hat to Caleb, his gaze falling for a moment on May and Anne with a look of grudging respect. "You have a sharp-eyed family, Mr. Reeves. You hold this land free and clear." 3 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the high peaks, but the small valley was bathed in the golden light of late autumn. The wheat Caleb had planted had sprouted, a carpet of vibrant green against the dark soil. A new room had been added to the cabin, built with Caleb's hands and the sisters' help. It was Anne's room, a quiet space for her to read the few books Caleb had managed to acquire. Their lives had found a new rhythm, one of partnership, not obligation. They were a family, forged not by law or tradition, but by a shared crisis and mutual respect. Caleb still slept on his pallet in the main room, but it was by choice now, a quiet testament to the promise he had made them. They ate their meals together, and the silence was no longer tense, but comfortable, punctuated by conversation and occasional soft laughter. The town of Redemption, having witnessed the swift and total collapse of Sterling's empire, treated them differently. The whispers had been replaced by nods of greeting. They were no longer a curiosity. They were the Reeves family, the people who had stood their ground and won. One evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, Anne rose and went to the small chest where they kept their things. She took out the small wooden box Caleb had shown them. She walked to the new stone mantelpiece he had built above the hearth and placed the box in the center. Inside, the 2 faded ribbons, one blue, one yellow, seemed to glow in the firelight. Caleb looked at the box, then at Anne, and then at May. No words were needed. The red silk dresses, symbols of a forced and fearful beginning, were folded away. The ribbons, a token of a child's kindness, were now the emblem of their home. May looked at the quiet cowboy and her brilliant sister, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fire. She realized that a home was not a building or a piece of paper from a land office. It was a small, safe space built together, a place where a debt from the past was not a burden to be carried, but a promise that had, against all impossible odds, been kept. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.